Welcome to the Find My Catalyst podcast. We all have problems we're looking to solve, and we know that there are solutions out there, but we struggle with this. How do we find the solution? Where does the nudge come from to help us take the next step and start solving tough problems? This podcast is designed to help you find your catalyst and take that next step. I'm Mike Simmons. I'm the founder of Catalyst Sale. This podcast, as all other ones, are brought to you by the Catalyst Sale Game Plan. If you'd like more information about the game plan, just take a look at catalystsale.com/game, and you'll find information there. I am really excited to have Kossack on the podcast today. Corey is the CEO of Aspireship. He is someone who just has an amazing perspective around the impact he's looking to make across people and across organizations. And one of the most fascinating things that he shared recently on Tyler Hall's Roller Coaster podcast was the importance of helping people who want to help themselves. And we get into this discussion. Hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. Well, let's get to it.
Corey, it is awesome to see you. I've been looking forward to this conversation. I first came across you through Christine Rogers, and then we've kind of interacted in social and that kind of stuff. And then I heard you on Tyler's podcast recently. And one of the things that you said, and I may butcher this quote because that tends to be my superpower, is butchering quotes, but it's helping people who want to help themselves. It's an area of focus. So what does that mean?
Yeah. So for me, this whole thing kind of came about in two ways. So one was through most of my life, I've been an entrepreneur in some capacity or joining early stage companies. And I didn't realize until, I don't know, maybe halfway through my work experience to date that everything had this theme of like, I wanted to help people who largely were going against the grain, right? So I've been an entrepreneur for most of my life. I know how hard that is. I know how little support there is, even though there's now this whole ecosystem around startups and fundraising and all this stuff. It's still like, it's the road less traveled. I mean, it really is. And so back in the early 2010s, I was thinking about doing a business and I really wanted to do something to help entrepreneurs. But the concept of doing something that would scale and really like fit the needs of most like technology entrepreneurs felt like, this is like a non-starter. Like it just doesn't really exist. And I probably wouldn't be the best person to do it anyway. So I'm not going to do that. But what is interesting, and I started with small business owners. And so I started to pull at this thread of who are the people who are working really hard to help better themselves and better their lives, but they just don't know what the path is, or they don't know how to go and do this. And the more I pulled at this and eventually got into Aspireship, which of course is about helping people who are looking to make a change in their career, upward or over or whatever, the more I found that I was finding myself in situations where individuals were asking for help. I was giving that help, and then they would not walk through the open door, right? And that could be anything from not just not doing the work, but choosing not to listen or choosing not to do something in a certain way because they felt they couldn't or wouldn't or whatever. And so it became just a big part of understanding that I'm going to help people who are doing something challenging that's not the happy path, but that are willing to say, okay, I'm diving in, I'm going at it, like, tell me what I can do and I'm going to do it.
Really powerful. I mean, as you talk about going against the grain, I think of friction and how much friction is created when we start to do things that we may be, that are uncomfortable, either because we just don't know it or we've not done it before, or we want to test. And so how do you test for people's capacity to deal with the friction and actually do the work?
That's interesting. So I think it depends on context, because we could talk about this in a lot of different contexts, especially as we start to look at people like business owners and entrepreneurs and those sorts of folks. But in the context of Aspireship and what we do currently, so we built this into the DNA of the company. So for those who are not aware, Aspireship is essentially a learning and a talent platform combined, targeted at people who are interested largely in the tech industry, but customer facing roles. And the whole idea is that it's a meritocracy, right? So no matter what you come from, if you are capable of doing a job well, and you're willing to demonstrate that capability, we want to help you get to where you need to go. And so what we did in terms of this platform is we built it so that if you think about this compared to, say, a traditional boot camp, a boot camp, what's required is you either write a check for a lot of money, or you sign on the dotted line saying, I'm going to give you a piece of my income or something like that, something that's still a big commitment, but it's financially driven. And then you're sort of dragged across the finish line, right? It's like, hey, show up at class at 8 p.m. every night and do this and do that. And we're going to make sure that you're pushed over to it. And instead we said, let's do the inverse and let's give you instant access to what it is that you need. And it's really up to you. We're not going to push you through. Do it or don't do it. Here is the open door. And so they essentially have to go and do a bunch of work on their own, self-paced. And then they have to apply that in actual like real life kind of role play situations of what it's like to do the job. And they sink or swim, because that's really what it's like when you get out and you eventually land a job in sales or whatever. Like, you got to figure it out. You got to show up. You got to do the work. And so us pulling you over the line isn't going to help.
So in your experience, what's the fallout rate? Whether you lean on Aspireship specific data or just
Sure.
other data that you've captured over your career, what percentage of people would you say raise their hand and say, I want help, but are actually willing to go and do the work, at least taking the next step?
Yeah. So I definitely think it depends on how you define the steps and what they're willing to do.
Yep.
But a pretty simple rule would be to say that 80% of people who raise their hands will not do anything past like a very, very basic task or basic undertaking. The 20% that remains, you probably have 50 or so percent that are kind of willing to go the distance from there. And so like you really whittle it down. I mean, we talk a bunch about this independent of Aspireship, related to Aspireship as well. You get into that like the 10th percentile, and then there's degrees within that. So that's kind of how it works.
I think it's really powerful to see it broken down by that. And you like the traditional like Pareto principle type thing, or 80-20. And then you say of that 20, there's actually 50%, which that seems high to me, but also cool to hear. And then when you break that down, really what we're talking about is 1 out of every 10 people that raise their hand are actually going to go out there and not only take those first steps, but actually see it all the way through to the end. And when you think about seeing it all the way through to the end, how do you define the end?
So again, it depends on context, but
Sure.
in this context of like, I'm transitioning from this type of work to this type of work. For us, the end means they're completing a full program,
Cool.
doing an assessment. If they do not pass that assessment, which isn't the easiest thing to do, they are actually willing to try again. Like, this is a huge thing. Like, you probably wouldn't be surprised, but a lot of people would be surprised how many people that are like, oh, I did all that and then I didn't pass. Like, forget this, right? And they pick up their ball and they go home, right? And it's like, no, you were right, that you just had to just push a little bit further, just a little bit more, and you're good, right? And so it's going through all of that and then realizing that, well, hey, the journey's not over, right? Just because I put in some work or have some level of achievement, which can mean I got a good score or I did what I needed to do, it doesn't mean that like everything's just done. Then you got to go out and you got to find the right company and you got to work through the interview process and you got to deal with the rejection and all of that stuff. And so I think once you get to that point and you secure the job that you were trying to get, from there, the stickiness is really high. And so, but that's to me is like kind of taking it full circle of saying like, all right, I'm seeing this all the way through and kind of pushing through roadblocks.
Yeah. And I want to bring back the design aspects of what we're talking about and designing for success and how you kind of scaffold things on, and whether you want to look at it in the context of like successive approximation or what have you, but you're layering on skills. And I think additive manufacturing has created a really cool visual of how this can work. So I want to get into the design stuff, but before we do that, so that we give everybody a bit more context, I'm going to describe my understanding of Aspireship or what excites me about Aspireship. And then you please fill in the gaps and the holes and whatnot. One of the cool things about Aspireship is Aspireship makes tech or other verticals more accessible. Verticals that people might have thought historically they couldn't get into because either they weren't technical, they didn't know somebody, they didn't know how to get in, they didn't have the skills. So number one, it starts to make this thing that felt out of reach more accessible. The way that it makes the thing more accessible is it highlights transferable skills that exist so that people can accelerate speed to learning or speed to impact, work through those skills, and then be able to put that work in context. And there are a number of different areas where this challenge comes up. Think of any transition that exists out in the marketplace, a transition from moving from the public sector, service, military, police, teaching, into the private sector, corporate side of things, whether early stage or later stage organization. How do I say that my after action review actually is similar to a post-call debrief and have those connection points go? Because the reality is we're all human beings, and these experiences are that we have, although we call them something different, there are a lot of similarities and there's some connective tissue. And the cool thing about this is it can drive amazing innovation inside organizations because of the creativity that comes in by bringing new blood into your organization. Is that a fair summary?
So I love the summary. It hits on a lot of points.
What did I miss?
I don't know that you missed anything. I think the thing that I would highlight is that the driving force for me to start this in the beginning was this notion that in hiring, and I mean all hiring, I'm not just talking about tech, I'm not just talking about sales and AI stuff. In all hiring, the default is help me find a lookalike, right? And the lookalike is not about skills or capability or fit. The lookalike is, did they do this job before? Did they do it at a company like ours before? Did they do it serving a customer like our customer before? And on and on and on. And so you've sort of heard this out in the marketplace. People will focus on things like SaaS experience if you're in the SaaS market, right? And so it used to be uncommon to hire someone without SaaS experience. We sort of helped break that down. Now what we're seeing, which has always been there, but it's really getting exaggerated now, and it's like really getting me going. So I'm getting my juices flowing. I'm thinking about how to attack this, is that people are going really deep into their industry or vertical set. So what I mean by that is they say, hey, we sell software or XYZ to insurance companies. So the person we hire needs to have an insurance background, right? Or a tax or accounting background, or a legal background, or a manufacturing background, or blah, blah, blah. And all these things are basically just their cheat codes for recruiters and companies of saying like, I know hiring's really hard, so I'm going to put all these things in, and that's going to help me because it de-risks it, and it just really doesn't. And it's just really silly. And so
I mean, people bloat job descriptions with keywords, and then people actually bloat resumes with things like keywords, and that becomes this way to sort and filter people out in the process.
It's just that it's all about the job that you had before, the industry you worked in before. And so if I have a stack of people and there are 50 incredibly capable people in that stack, but the 51st person who happens not to be that capable worked in hospitality, serving a certain segment and whatever for 5 years, and that's the segment I'm serving, I'm going for that 51st person.
Right.
Makes no sense, but it's just because this is all very hard. And so the whole idea was if we could help hiring managers and companies justify the quote unquote risk that they think they're taking on an individual who's highly capable by saying, hey, they actually prepared for this specific thing. So this is not some like bartender that you met that you thought was like really good with people and you just decided to hire them. Like this is somebody who intentionally prepared for this.
Yeah.
And that if we could do that, we could sort of change the game and get people in the workforce unstuck, because most of the workforce is stuck.
So why does this bias persist? This bias toward you need to have a background in molecular chemistry if you want to serve organizations who happen to be in biotech? Like, why does this persist?
So I happen to believe that it persists because in general, hiring the right people for the right role is rather difficult.
Yeah.
And even when you get, and so the other funny thing, like tangent about this, is that sometimes companies conflate what it means for whether hiring is difficult or easy, right? And so easy to them might mean like, hey, I put up the job and then I had all these applicants. Or I put up the job and I hired somebody 2 weeks later, like that was easy. Doesn't mean they got it right. Right? Doesn't mean that person will stick. Doesn't mean that person will perform well or be a good fit for the company. But those things are kind of disjointed. So like the whole picture isn't really pulled together in a cohesive way that everyone understands. And so I think that especially in like growth environments where we're all moving quickly, we're trying to achieve things, I think all of it is sort of like at this archaic level still, where we don't see it with the level of detail or accuracy that we see like marketing analytics, which you could argue is still not super great, but you get the point.
Yeah.
And so I think that there needs to be something. And so if we solve the industry thing, like they'll make up something else, right? Like it used to be, and now still you're hearing things in media and stuff about like, oh, we got to drop the college degree. And I was like, wasn't this a thing like 20 years ago? Like, aren't we past this notion? Like, because I think most of us are in the workforce past this notion, and it's still holding some people back. But the bigger thing is downstream. It's like this industry, like very niche specific thing to where, Mike, if you've spent the majority of your life in e-learning and L&D type stuff, like that's you, that's who you are. You can't go work in the automotive sphere. Like you don't have the brain capacity for that. How could you? Because you're an L&D person, right?
Especially with my degree from Arizona State University. I mean,
that's right.
Come on.
What good does it do, right? So anyway, so I hope that answers the question, but that is generally why it persists.
Yeah, there's it's a couple of things I heard there in both parts, both the first part and then the after the persist part is, number one, if you have a framework that has been used historically, there's less risk or less perceived risk inside the organization if you follow it. It's the nobody got fired for hiring IBM kind of mentality. Yep. So we want to be innovative as organizations, but we're going to go ahead and do things the way we've always done them because that's safe, which we laugh about because when you have that kind of conversation, people start to smile. The other part about it is not being able to get yourself out of the mindset of, hey, innovation happens when you bring new things together. So there are going to be some organizations who are going to be a little bit slower in adopting new technology or in the way that they look at technology. Either because their spectrum of risk is so much tighter and they can't operate outside of it because of any number of things. Think financial services versus, well, you were dealing with a lot of data in Booker, but financial services versus personal training, like different spectrum of risk relative to what people have access to related to each of those pieces of data. So there's some different components. And the third piece is it is hard. Like as you add additional layers or variables into all of this stuff, it makes things more complex. And that complexity makes it hard to go through this process of hiring. So those are just a couple of things that popped out for me relative to what you shared there.
Yeah. The other stuff that I'll highlight is we're talking about hiring, and for good reason, and this is an issue in hiring, but there's a related issue, and that is about internal mobility at the company.
Right. Yep.
Right. And this actually, to me, I saw it in a different way, but when I was at MindBody after we were acquired, I saw this big time in terms of individuals within the company kept coming to me saying, I want to make a shift. And that shift may not have even been massive. It's like, I'm on the phone dealing with customers all day in a support capacity, and I think I could be really good at sales. Like that's a pretty simple shift. Like at least you could imagine that could happen for someone, the right person, right? Yeah. To all sorts of things. And the issue remains there that we have the industry bias, but we have the functional bias too. And so even internally, and yes, it does happen where people get their shot and all that stuff, but for the most part, internally, those biases exist. and people don't get the opportunity or the real pathway to make a significant change, right? People draw out like career pathing maps and like things like this that follow this logical stream of, well, if you're in support, you might have a shot at customer success, or you might be able to go into this other operational thing, but you couldn't go outside of that. Like those are your swim lanes, right? And I think in the same way, we, and maybe even more pronounced, and especially in this economic moment, companies could do so much more with the talent they have if their minds could be open to, all right, let's put a system in place to let people raise their hand and say, like, I want to move to sales. I want to move to customer success. I want to move to marketing. I want to move into this type of role that I've never done before. How can I show you that I'm capable of this? And if we could put systems in place to do that, do some reskilling, all of that kind of stuff, then we could be, especially these companies that are obsessed with the vertical industry knowledge and stuff, like we could solve that problem right there.
How do we address the leadership? I'm going to put leadership and culture together here, which is probably not super useful, but I'll bundle them together in this. How do we solve for both the leadership and culture challenges inside organizations when thinking differently about the way they think of human capital and talent and problem solving inside organizations? How do we solve for that challenge at a leadership level?
Yeah, it's a tough challenge. And to me, this was even before starting, I recognize this as like, this would be the largest hurdle for Aspireship as a company and for me as CEO of a startup to do, is that it's about making a paradigm shift. It's not just proving it, but it's like getting the mind share around like, we could do something different and I could do this without it feeling like I'm sticking my neck out, right? And so I think it's a very challenging ask, but what I would say is the things that I've seen work really well when you think about how technology has progressed and new approaches have progressed, it's when things get to the level like, look at what Bezos did with Amazon. He did it this way. Look at what, you follow these mega examples, and then it sort of becomes the gospel that people are following of like, hey, I'm going to run this playbook at my company. So I think we just need to lead through real world examples and a lot of it. But I think that this is a long-term challenge. It's going to take quite a bit to reorient everyone's mind.
And I hope, is probably a better way to look at it, but I hope that people start to think a bit differently about reskilling folks inside an organization and reapplying those skills inside the organization. And it comes up a lot with this real big, a lot of noise right now around ChatGPT-3 as an example. Yeah. And we know 4 will come and 5 will come, and we'll get to a point where there's 100, there'll be there will be these iterations that continue to build on each other. And it's, how do we get people to start thinking a bit differently about how these tools can actually enable humans to do better human things, so humans can focus on the things that humans do really, really, really well. And now it becomes more of like an augmenting the human inside the environment. And if you're, as an organization, if you're stuck in your siloed thinking of this is how we have to hire or how we have to place or how we have to go, it's going to be really hard to get creative about how you augment those roles. So are you optimistic about the future in this context?
That's a complicated question. So I am optimistic about the future in this context. However, I think that there's a very painful transition that's going to happen, is the way I think about it. So think about it in the context of, I'll just take the ChatGPT context. Okay. Yep. So the speed of disruption is the thing that concerns me. It's not the long-term end state. So as one example, I could see, this is a pretty easy one for people to digest because there's so much about ChatGPT generating content. So imagine you have a 10-person marketing team, right? One does brand stuff, one does design stuff.
Yep.
3 do, copy. Others are doing ad stuff. Like there's so many different, facets of a marketing team, right? You could see with the right knowledge that 10-person team becoming a 2-person team augmented by all this AI that's available. And so that means there's 8 people that don't have a job now and they have to go do something else. we can make the argument, which has been made and tends to be true over time, and that technology breeds economic productivity. And in the end, it all ends up really well, really well off for everyone. However, in this instance and other things like it, because it is so powerful and came so fast, I think that the speed of the disruption will be painful, and the adjustment, it won't just be like, oh, people will just fall out of that and then fall into this other thing. I think that there's potential for a lot of economic pain, personally and otherwise, related to this in terms of making the transition to what does the future look like with this new reality. And so that's sort of how I think about it. I think it's exciting in many ways, but I think there's just going to be a lot of disruption in the labor force.
So are there things that we can do as leaders to help reduce some of that disruption, or maybe even slow down the speed of disruption? Like, I don't know, create some speed bumps or remove some capacity or some of those things. But are there things that we can be thinking about as leaders to help, knowing that disruption will be there, to either mitigate, slow down, reduce the potential impact there?
Great question. So I think on a micro basis, so by micro basis, I mean a individual company, say your company, right? So let's say you have 100 employees at the company, you're doing whatever revenue you're doing. If you can look at how you can apply this in a way that very quickly will add productivity and revenue opportunity for the company, expansion opportunity for the company, then rather than maybe hiring as quickly as you would, you might stay steady state with your team, but be doing double the revenue because now you can do all this stuff. And that is the perfect way to sort of mitigate the speed bumps in this transition, plus reskilling folks, right? So again, if you take the 10-person marketing team thing, if you only really need 2, and those 8 people all have the desire to be here at the company, to be doing something else, you have to create pathways for them to do that and be additive to the whole story, or else they have to be displaced and go somewhere else. So I would think about it that way. The challenge, though, is that at the macro level, we both know what's going to happen, right? Which is that people, I think the other part that hasn't been said, and hopefully we won't lose the audience with all this stuff, but the other part that hasn't been said is that this is not the only material change happening in the world right now. And so when you stack this on top of the other big things that have happened in the last few years and are continuing to happen now, there will just be a splintering effect where so many individuals and companies are going to freak out, for lack of a better term, and sort of scramble to figure out what the next step is for them and what things they need to do and change. And it's just going to create a lot of turmoil.
It's why leading or leadership is hard. Operating is hard. All of these things. These are hard things, and they don't get any easier if you do them in a vacuum. And like we just talked about kind of the vacuum of AI and Chat GPT and what happens there. But as Corey brings up, we've got remote, people going into a remote working environment who've never been in a remote working environment realize that they could actually do that. And then people looking to bring people back. And then you kind of get back into this question of, are we bringing people back because it actually accelerates communication and performance and some of the things we want to do? Like, are we bringing people back by design, or are we bringing people back because we're back into some of the older management style approaches, which is, if I can't see you doing the work, you must not be doing the work. So there's so many layers to this very, very, very complex onion of stuff that we're talking about. And if you are still listening, this is for you. So thank you for continuing to hang out with us. So Corey, how do you think about design? Like, when you talked about these kind of scenarios that happen as people go through and they demonstrate, yep, I can deal with a little bit of friction and move on and then maybe get to the end. How do you think about designing for success in the context of helping people really be successful as they go through an Aspireship program or as they start to transition into other roles inside an organization? How do you think about design in general?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, with whether it's transitioning roles or getting a new role, it's largely the same, right? It's about learning the skills, applying them, and then, sort of moving through the process that way. But in the context of how do we design the experience? So from the beginning, and I think some of the greatest entrepreneurs, and I'm not including myself in that club, but the greatest entrepreneurs sort of look at things with a fresh perspective. And instead of saying, this is how an online learning course looks, right? Or whatever, they say, okay, how would I want this to be? Like what could be different than what's already been done in terms of doing this that would make the experience better for someone? And so the first thing we did was we said, hey, instead of having a talking head looking at the camera and saying, here are the 5 steps to doing blah, blah, blah in this job, which is what, if you go on most of the big learning sites, that's how it works. We said, we're going to teach through conversations, right? And so it would actually be a little bit like this, but structured and leading down a path of things that you need to know and understand to do these jobs well, as well as getting a peek behind the curtain of like, what does this really look like? Let's cut the BS, right? About those sort of like peel back the onion, look behind the curtain. What does this actually look like to do this day to day? How does this feel, right? To do this. And that's really what we went for. And I can't tell you how many people, and by people, I mean like investors and others that were knowledgeable in the space before we started, that said like, I'm not sure that you can do it this way, right? Like what, I don't even know if I'm saying the word right. They'd ask me what pedagogy or whatever are you following? Yeah. And I says, I don't know. I made this up. It's the Corey pedagogy. This is what we're doing.
But Corey, that doesn't fit into my rubric here. Like, how is this actually going to work?
Yeah, that's right. And so the end result of just that decision alone was people saying, this was so engaging and entertaining. I didn't feel like I was taking a class. And yet I learned so much, right? And I have the stuff that I need. And so it's just, for starters, taking a fresh look at that and saying, okay, could you do it that way? The second thing was, we're all familiar with the concept of projects, right? To reinforce learning. Well, we took that to a level of saying, let's try and emulate a real world scenario. So we built a audio and video role play system that does not require a human trainer on the other end, but it's, as an individual, you can essentially go in and say like, okay, here's the scenario. You're walking into your meeting with Mike. You've had 2 meetings with Mike already. Mike has indicated that today should generally be the day when, he's ready to kind of pull the trigger and get going, kick off the meeting and summarize where you've been and try and move the conversation forward. And then they go, they record themselves, they're doing this. And then they say like, hey, we good to, get this thing rolling. And then Mike goes, yeah, so I had this thing happen the other day with marketing where they're giving me a really hard time about this, that, or whatever. How do we deal with that? And then it goes, respond to Mike. Right. And they're like, right. And so long story short is that we designed it for all the instructions aren't there. There's no one right answer. You're going to be uncomfortable. Some people are going to kick and scream and say, hey, but you didn't tell me how to do this thing. Or you didn't tell me the details about what I'm selling. Like I'm supposed to sell this product, this imaginary product. I don't even know what the product does. Like, Where are the features? How do I link? It's like, you're going to be in situations like this where you're just going to have to roll. So roll, right? And some people can rise to that challenge and some people can't. And so those are natural friction points that stop people that they have to push through, but they're also really great for the learning side of it. And the last sort of piece I'll say, and then I'll stop, is that in that whole exercise we talked about, when we're not in assessment time, we're just in like the learning time at this moment.
Okay.
What we did was, rather than saying what you'd expect, which is like some kind of AI that picks apart what they said and says, oh, you should have said this, you should have said that. We let them go through the exercise and then we play the exact same clip, but a very seasoned professional doing it.
Very cool.
Look at how they handled it. And then we don't say they did this and you did that. We let them sort of self-reflect and go, okay. All right. I get it. This is interesting.
Do people go through and redo the learning after that? So let's say I see this. Do you find people go back and run through the scenario again?
They do, but I actually think it's more like they will go through and they'll do everything. They'll digest everything. Yep. And then they're sort of preparing for their final, and they'll go back Sometimes we've seen people over the years, we've had people send us pictures of like, I have 37 pages of notes and, stuff. And so they'll go through some of that. But also we'll see even down the line, right? Like somebody actually lands a job, they do stuff, and then they still go back, right? We have people that have been even like AEs at like pretty big name companies that will leave and they'll go try and get another AE role. And they'll reach out and say, hey, I'm preparing for this thing and I want to make sure I really nail it. I want to nail the role play. And it's like, well, when was the last time you looked at SaaS sales foundations? Some of the, go look at this one about asking questions or getting a decision or whatever. And they're like, oh yeah. And they're like, oh yeah, that was so helpful. And I just totally landed the job. Right. And this is years after, being in the role.
Yeah. And so a couple of things that are really powerful there are not only the kind of the general instruction and the general piece of information in a conversational manner where it feels like you're engaged in as you said, a structured or you're engaged in a structured discussion and you're seeing the back and forth, getting into the position where you can do the practical application piece, and then being after the fact, being able to go through and see what really good or phenomenal or 1% looks like, and go through the practice of assessing self. I think a lot of times, and we used to talk about this way back when in the SmartForce days, SmartForce Skillsoft days, but the Pinkerhoff has been quoted and butchered over times. And that's the whole forgetting curve and the scrap learning and all of that kind of stuff. And it's this piece around, hey, I can go into a sales kickoff meeting and I can learn a lot of stuff and I can get really excited about seeing someone talk about these things. But if I don't actually go and put it into practice and do the work, and I don't have somebody else who's kind of seeing how that work goes, at what point do I start to fall back into old habits because those old habits are a bit more comfortable? Or even worse, you've got a manager inside the organization who's talking more about activity metrics and they start pulling you back into those old things. Thanks for sharing the design stuff. That designing with intention is super, super powerful. And I like how the friction continues to increase over time as you go through it, so that there's this, you're working on keeping people inside this flow state. So really, really cool stuff.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Yeah. When people fail at this, what kind of feedback do you get from people who fail? What do you see when people fail? Meaning that they didn't end up, they made it through the 2 out of 10 and they happened to fall into the category of the 1 out of those 2 who just didn't see it. What kind of feedback do you get there?
Oh man, it's really varied. It's really varied over time. And I'll give you the 2 extremes. And then of course there's everything in the middle. But the 2 extremes are, I'll start with the positive extreme of thank you so much for the feedback. This is really helpful. I'm going to go back and do XYZ and learn this. What's the process for trying again? Blah, blah, blah. Like, I'm really committed to this and thank you for everything. Right. So that's like one, like very extreme positive.
Yep.
We see that the most. I don't know if I'll put a percentage on it.
Cool.
Extreme negative is expletives, go blank yourself. You're discriminating against me because I'm this or I'm that.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
Any number of things. This is a scam, all sorts of stuff. And it's not even like, hey, see you later. It's just like, hey, you didn't score high enough. Here are the areas of improvement. If you want to try again, here's the path. And so there's sort of those 2 extremes. And then there's like things in the middle, including like, well, I'm taking my ball and I'm going home, but I'm not as angry about it, or I'm not going to hurl insults or make it all your fault or, any of that stuff. But I think the important thing about this is that there is a legitimate chunk of the population that does believe that if they did something, they did some amount of effort or work, they are owed the achievement. And that is not reality. And so that disconnect is real. And so there is that comes out sometimes.
Is the participation trophy stuff You started seeing it with our kid. I've got a 17-year-old and a 20-year-old, and you started seeing some of the participation trophy type stuff come up. And it's unfortunate when you get into some of that entitlement, because the entitlement does not work when you actually get out there and have to do work. So
not to mention that there's part of what we're trying to foster is a mindset of learning, culture of learning. This is what leads to having the availability to brush up on things, to keep learning new things proactively and not just relying on the sales kickoff once a year or whatever, as you mentioned. And, very early on, we saw some very interesting things, especially during the pandemic, where we would have, so our first, program, as you know, is dedicated to people who are wanting to get into software sales, right? Either SER or like AE level, generally. And so we had existing people in the industry, like a SaaS AE that was looking to change jobs, go through, and they didn't pass. And they said, is this a joke? Like, I'm already an AE. Like, you guys don't know what you're talking about. And it just so happens that just because you were able to get a job doing something doesn't mean that you're doing it as effectively as you could. And this is something that it's hard for people to swallow. It's the same thing with the paradigm shift about, like, well, they did it before, so they're the default hire. And it's like, no, the teacher who's never sold a day in their life performed way better than you on this. What does that say?
It's a good bridge into both continuous learning, reinforcing continuous learning, and talking a bit about the creating opportunities for people to move vertically inside organizations and solving for some of the really interesting problems and challenges that will persist throughout over time, related to how do we help our customers be more successful. So you went from getting into SaaS on the BDR, SDR, AE side of things, and then now you've recently moved into customer success as another area. And so can you share a bit of experience around and what you're seeing in the market and why customer success was so interesting to you, specifically around how that creates opportunities for people to move vertically inside organizations, whether they were in a revenue role or another role inside the organization, moving into these very important roles that interact directly with customers?
Yeah. So the way I think about it is that this is about the foundational skills and the foundational mindset that really everyone should have and everyone needs, independent of what jobs are open and, where's the demand and all that stuff. And so I think of it as pre-sale and post-sale. A lot of other people think of it as, well, I'm going to be a customer success manager in this very specific role. And it's like, well, actually, there's like tons of different post-sales roles, and they're all called different things, and they have different pieces of the puzzle. But ultimately thinking in the way of, you have a customer, and what are you going to do to support that customer in achieving success over time? There's a bunch of different things that go into that. And so you connect those two things from a customer-facing perspective. You've sort of covered the spectrum of roles that are going to exist in the company around customer-facing stuff. And so that was why it was the most interesting to us to sort of tackle next. And on top of that, because of the economic moment we're in with all the tightening and all that stuff, in the tech market especially, but we'll hit other things as well, this becomes extra important. Now, the interesting thing about it is that we've actually seen companies are investing much less than they say they are in these things. There's a lot of talk about it. There's not a lot of dollars going to it.
Is it trending in either direction?
So in our primary market, which is tech, I think it is all trending the opposite direction of where you want to see. The volume in terms of how much noise and chatter and evangelism there is about it is going through the roof. But the actual dollars are, hey, you know what? Like, we need to slim down. Like, let's shrink the CS team. Or here's the other thing I would say is, I happen to think that the branding of customer success has been a really positive thing because it's attractive to people. So the branding of what it means to be customer success is drawing people to the profession, as opposed to traditional customer support or whatever. You're like, oh, Like, oh, that would just be the worst job ever to have to be there and take these angry calls all day, right? Like that's the way we think about those two things. But I really believe there's a merging of the two. If we just think about it as post-sale, support and guidance for customers and sort of redefine what those roles are all responsible for and brand it all around customer success, I think that we'll just see much, much better results for companies. So that's the thing that I'm pushing for in terms of being vocal about it, that companies will keep hiring for support to the extent that they need to support a certain volume of customers. But the whole success notion is like, hey, it's this like layer on top of everything else. It doesn't have to be. It just needs to be infused into what you do in post-sale.
These names, these words that we say out loud around these things, whether it's customer success or go-to-market or RevOps or account executive or business development, whatever, or strategic account manager or any of these other names that get thrown out there, remind me of the scene in Princess Bride when the dude keeps saying inconceivable and the other guy says, look, you keep using that word, but I don't think you know what it means. And I think the marketing stuff that you're talking about, that trajectory that everybody gets excited about, they just start talking about it because it's the new thing. And we've created this new, whatever, customer-led growth, product-led growth. We're going to do buyer enablement. All of these things. And I think we do ourselves a disservice when that happens. Ideally, or what I'd like to see more of is people start asking questions about what does this mean in the context of how we go to market, our organization, how we operate our business, how our customers engage with us, like how the customers, that connection point between our business and the customer, and then how things are looked at from a people perspective. And if we start to isolate for variables and define in those areas, we'll get into situations where we're using a common vocabulary across the organization, and we won't come up with this new thing that that we call customer success, which happens to be the thing I did when I first joined SmartForce as a learning consultant. We were in a role where we wanted to help our customers be successful with the SaaS product that we were delivering into the organization before SaaS was a thing. Like, it reminds me of my favorite quote, which is the Marie Antoinette one. There's nothing new except what has been forgotten. And as you apply this, you start to see where you can pull people across organizations, do some really amazing things. Corey, this has been an amazing conversation. Where can people find more about what you're working on? Where can they connect with you directly? Where would you like to send folks?
Sure. The two things, aspireship.com.
Yep.
And Corey Kossack on LinkedIn.
Awesome. We'll share this. If you know of someone who would find value in the conversation, please share it with them. Let Corey and I know both via LinkedIn. We like to see those comments and the shares. Sales is a thinking process. Business is a thinking process. Life is a thinking process. How are you thinking differently about your process?